All right, meantime, the U.S. military relies on satellites in space for communication and intelligence, but some officials say they could be vulnerable to attack.
Countries like China are actively testing anti-satellite weapons. Here's a look at part of David Martin's report last night on 60 Minutes.
If those satellites are now at risk, that is something that, from the U.S. military's point of view, is new. Because it's always believed those satellites, there wasn't really a significant threat to those capabilities.
Brian Whedon served as an officer in Air Force Space Command until 2007. He's now technical advisor to the Secure World Foundation, which promotes the peaceful use of space.
The topic for today's discussion
Whedon says the Chinese have test-fired as many as 6 ground-based anti-satellite weapons. Only one in 2007 actually hit a satellite and created debris, but one of the others soared to new heights.
There was one test in May of 2013 that may have gone as high as 30,000 kilometers. And that's one that I think really is kind of causing quite a bit of concern on the U.S. side.
To understand just how far that is, the International Space Station orbits at about 200 miles above the Earth. And those GPS satellites we showed you orbit at 12,000 miles. The 2013 test launch Whedon's talking about is believed to have gone up to 18,600 miles, just shy of what's known as geosynchronous or geostationary orbit. And that's where the U.S. military has stationed some of its most valuable missile warning sensors and top-secret communications devices that serve as its eyes and ears in time of war.
I think what keeps a lot of American military planners up at night is if China has anti-satellite capabilities, when do they use those in a conflict? Do they use them at the start to try and blind the U.S.?
Those sound like the crown jewels of American satellites up there in geosynchronous orbit.
Absolutely. Those satellites were developed in an environment where the U.S. assumed there would not be reason to attack them. So you end up with a small number of very expensive satellites that have a lot of capability packed onto each one. End result is juicy targets.
And David Martin joins us now from the Pentagon. David, thanks for being here. As we heard in your report, these satellites, they're very expensive, but they've also become huge targets. So what does China's 2013 launch, something that this country calls a science experiment, point to?
Well, it points to the fact that the U.S. is going to have to figure out a way to defend those satellites in the event that China develops a true weapon that could go up to that height, about 22,000 miles, and destroy one of those satellites. There aren't very many ways to defend a satellite. You can't armor a satellite the way you would, for instance, a tank, simply because if you put armor on there, you'd never get it into space, or if you got it into space, it would use up all its fuel in a very short span of time. You can make satellites more maneuverable, but everything's a trade-off. If you're going to make a satellite maneuverable, that means you have to put more fuel on it in order to be able to fire its thrusters. And of course, the more fuel you put on it, the heavier you make it, the harder it is to get into space. And then you have to start making trade-offs. Do we want more fuel so it's more maneuverable? That means we have to take off some of the sensors that are so important to those satellites. And that's the kind of game that's going on out there in deep space right now. And the U.S. has done one other thing, which is position 2 surveillance satellites out there in what's called geosynchronous orbit to do nothing but look at what other satellites from other countries are up to see if they are exhibiting any patterns that might turn out to be a threat to those American satellites up there.
David, let's listen to an excerpt from last night's piece describing a bit about the development of a space plane.
The only two things you've told me about the U.S. ability to fight in space are the ability to maneuver your satellites and to jam other satellites. Is that it?
That's not it, but that's all I can tell you.
One secret project is hiding in plain sight. It's the X-37B spaceplane. a small, remotely piloted vehicle that can fly in space for 20 months at a time.
This is a model of the space.
A model of it hangs in Hyten's headquarters in Colorado.
So here's your chance to end all the speculation about what the space plane is really for.
It's really for cool things.
For instance.
For instance, it goes up to space, but unlike other satellites, it actually comes back. Anything that we put in the payload bay that we take up to space, we can now bring back, and we can learn from that.
Can you tell me whether or not someday the space plane is going to become a weapon system?
The intent is, I cannot answer that question.
But if you're determined not to create any more debris in space, why can't you say that this might not become a weapon system?
I'm not going to say what it's going to become, because we're experimenting.
David, you really tried. What's your reaction? How high are the stakes?
Well, the stakes are immeasurable almost. I mean, for not just for the American military, but for our way of life, because our way of life now depends on satellites. That's how we go places today. We read directions off our navigators in our car or on our smartphones, and that is all coming from these global positioning satellites, which the U.S. has launched into space. The military uses those satellites to target its weapons. But you and I use those satellites to go about our everyday business. And if those satellites were suddenly to go down, you and I would be greatly inconvenienced. The military would have to go back to an earlier World War II form of warfare.
All right, David Martin at the Pentagon. Thanks so much, David.
Sure thing.